The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everyone, I see that there's about 5 people in the room right now, and we'll be expecting a handful more. So it's only 11:58 right now, so we still have a little bit of time. So I'm going to pop back on in probably about 4 minutes here. Just give an extra couple minutes for people to show up, and yeah, you'll you'll hear from me again then. Thanks. Hey everyone. I just realized I still had my screen share on, so you got to see a little bit of the back end here. So it looks like everybody is here, actually. I think we might be missing a couple people, but they'll be showing up right away. And I think that there's just one person who signed up like just right before this, so Victoria's going to help them get signed up. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming. This presentation today is Police Information Check the Only Way? And my name's Graham. I'm the Senior Coordinator of Programs at Volunteer Alberta. And Volunteer Alberta is a capacity building organization that helps nonprofits and voluntary organizations throughout the province do their work better. So we provide professional development resources and networking opportunities, and just generally build the capacity of the nonprofit sector. Yeah, I also have on the line today Hillary Whittle. And Hillary is the manager of the Police Information Check Unit and Alarm Control Section. Yeah, I'm really glad that we could have a representative from Edmonton Police Services here today. As you know, this is kind of an Edmonton region webinar, and the reason that we kind of, made a webinar of all things geographically specific is because we wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity to connect directly with your local police. Yeah, so Hillary, did you have anything you wanted to mention before we get started here?
Nope, just hello.
Perfect. All right, thanks, Hillary. Okay, so I'm just going to go over a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the next slide here. So there is on GoToWebinar a questions feature that you can use to communicate with us. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type in there, and we will get to those at the end of the content portion of the presentation once we get into the Q&A section. So we won't be taking questions during the presentation. It's just a little bit difficult to manage time when we're doing that. And then there's also a hands up button that you can use during the Q&A section as well. And that will let us know that you want to actually have your microphone unmuted so you can chat with us a little bit. Yeah, so that's the, I think that's about it. Oh, in terms of tech support, sorry, Victoria Petta is also on the line. She's the coordinator for programs at Volunteer Alberta. And she is just available to kind of help if you have any tech issues. Her message in the chat, I think it should have been sent to everybody, has information on how to contact her, but just in case you can't see it, her email is screening, as in volunteer screening, at volunteeralberta.ab.ca. So that's screening at volunteeralberta.ab.ca. She can help you out. And then as I'm going through this presentation here, I'm going to point out things that you may want to contact your local police department about. This presentation was developed kind of more broadly before, which is why you'll see that note that says 2020 Volunteer Screening Series. I realize this is not 2020 anymore. This is kind of an older presentation that we like to redo. So if you notice that I'm saying you should contact your local police department and you think that you probably would after this presentation, keep those questions noted because we are lucky to actually have EPS on the call today. So you can actually ask those questions in real time and everyone can kind of get the answer for them. So yeah, I guess that's about all I have for housekeeping. So I'm just going to move on to the rest of the presentation here. Okay, come on. There we go. Okay, so what is the Volunteer Screening Program? The Volunteer Screening Program is where this presentation comes from. It's the program that funds all of our webinar work around screening, and it's a collection of different educational and funding opportunities that help organizations develop their volunteer screening capacity. And when we say volunteer screening, or just screening, we're very broadly describing the process of defining the relationship between volunteers and their organizations. In screening, it's a really big topic, and it encompasses a lot of subtopics, such as the one that we're covering today. But these topics all collectively aim to improve the quality and the safety of the programs and services in our communities. So knowing what we mean by screening, Volunteer Alberta provides educational resources and tools designed to help nonprofits improve their volunteer screening processes and procedures. We administer a vulnerable sector check fee waiver for volunteers in many municipalities throughout Alberta, including Edmonton. We provide micro grants, known as volunteer screening development grants, to help organizations cover the costs associated with developing their unique volunteer screening processes and procedures. And then the work that we do, it wouldn't be possible without the generous funding of the Government of Alberta. So we'd like to thank them. We'd also like to thank Volunteer Canada, who has provided support and expertise on screening across Canada. Volunteer Canada and Public Safety Canada published the Screening Handbook, and this handbook is an invaluable guide to volunteer screening, and we crib from it all the time. I think part of this presentation was developed with information from the Screening Handbook. So if you have questions around screening, we highly recommend that you look up Volunteer Canada and the Screening Handbook. It's freely available online. And lastly, please understand that Volunteer Alberta, we do not provide legal advice. This webinar and our resources, they'll provide some useful general information, but you should bring any concerns that are specific to your organization to a legal professional. So just keep that in mind. We are not lawyers. Okay. Okay, so police information checks are probably the most common topic that we receive questions about in the volunteer screening program. Nonprofits across Alberta utilize police information checks really heavily, and for a good reason. As we go through this presentation, we're going to note the many different reasons you may or may not need a police information check. And to clarify, a police information check is a collection of offense information, including convictions, non-convictions, and other police information available from police record management systems and provincial court records. This definition comes to us by way of the new Alberta Police Information Check disclosure procedures, and those are endorsed by the Alberta Association of Chiefs of Police. So this document, it's really handy, and it's attached as a handout to the webinar. So in GoToWebinar, you probably will see a handout section where you can download handouts. It'll be in there. If you're not seeing that, we're also going to follow up after this presentation with an email, and we'll include all the handouts with that too. So don't worry too much if you don't get it today. Yeah, it's a really helpful document if you're learning, if you're trying to get into like the nitty-gritty of disclosure. Before we really get into the pros and cons of police information checks, though, it's really important to understand what they are and how they fit into the bigger picture of volunteer screening. Police information checks, they can provide valuable information about a paid staff member or a volunteer's history with law enforcement. And this information can be very useful for guiding an organization in its risk management work by helping match volunteers with appropriate opportunities based on the risk and the liability in the position. However, something that should be made really, really clear right off the bat is that obtaining a police information check is not the only step in screening volunteers. It's a really important tool in the toolbox of volunteer screening, but they shouldn't be the first or the only step in your organization's screening processes. One of the reasons that PICS can't be relied on as the only measure an organization takes when screening volunteers is that these checks vary from municipality to municipality. Across the country and across the province, every municipality has different processes and titles for these checks. And in Canada, there are more than 1,900 local, regional, provincial, and territorial police services. And the type of information each service provides, the cost, the names of the reports, they all vary greatly depending on which service you go to. So police information check processes are currently in the process of being aligned, like I was talking about, with disclosure guidelines, but they still do vary greatly depending on the stations. Even we're not talking about disclosure, just the actual process you follow to get a check changes from station to station. So yeah, we have that disclosure guideline if you want that information, but the processes are going to be kind of dependent on the municipality. And then the information that you get from a person, it might also not even be everything that you could get if they're from a different municipality that might not even show up in that service's databases. So yeah, that's one of the reasons. And then PICS, they're also separate from criminal record checks. We want to make sure that that's clarified. Sometimes people use those terms interchangeably. They're not the same. A criminal record check is obtained from a private third party and will only indicate the existence of a criminal record. A criminal record check will also not contain information relating to any upcoming court appearances or relevant provincial statute convictions. And lastly, the main reason that PICS can't be the only measure that an organization takes when they're screening volunteers is that they're a poor indicator of future behavior. So PICS, they do give an indication of past behavior, but it's only really the behavior that law enforcement actually knows about. And if a person has a pattern of abusive or criminal behavior, but they've never been caught, then this will obviously not show up in a police information check. And even if they were caught, depending on whether or not they were convicted, it's still possible that that information won't end up making it into a police information check. So those PICS, they can't really predict a person's future behavior very effectively. This type of prediction, it really can only be made with any degree of accuracy through other parts of the volunteer screening process. So keep those things in mind. Okay, so before we get into the, meat of the presentation here, I need to go over some important definitions and concepts with you. And the first thing we're going to talk about is duty of care. Duty of care is a legal principle and the fundamental premise underlying volunteer screening. It's the obligation to fulfill a legal, ethical, and moral duty to care and protect clients, volunteers, employees, and in some cases funders. The appropriate level or standard is dependent upon the reasons why your organization exists and the people involved. So, the client base that you serve. And duty of care, it's applied to both individuals and organizations, meaning that you have a duty of care as an employee, as a volunteer, or a client, but your organization itself also has a collective duty of care. Now, duty of care isn't always kind of the way that we think about it when based on the description that I just had. This concept, it essentially outlines your basic responsibility to care about and for the people around you. That's kind of the main thrust of duty of care. One of the main reasons that a nonprofit organization may ask for a PIC is because it's a really tangible and simple way to attempt to fill one's duty of care. So, yeah. Now, a standard of care is the degree or level of service, attention, and care or protection that one owes another according to the law. So you might also hear standard of care referred to as reasonable care, and reasonable care, it has a lot to do with negligence. So courts in the past have determined negligence by judging whether a person engages or acts or omits. Sorry. I see. I'm reading through a lot of definitions here that are above my head sometimes. So. So courts do determine negligence by judging whether a person engages in acts or omissions that they could reasonably know would cause harm to another. So, for example, they might be not providing reasonable care if they're working in or around a children's play area and they leave dangerous chemicals or equipment in the play area. That is something that would not be considered reasonable care. A person might be considered negligent in this cause because they should reasonably know that this would cause harm to a child. Another example that might be relevant to many of the small nonprofits who actually use the volunteer screening program is if a coach simply leaves children unattended and unsupervised for any period of time, or if they host practices on an unsafe playing field. These situations, they might be deemed not to be providing an adequate standard of care for the children they're tasked with. So the standard of care that you provide in a situation, it has to account for the safety of all involved. So the people that vulnerable people that we were just talking about, children, but also the volunteer, the client, and your organization. So, you have to make sure that all of the people involved in the situation are protected. Now, let's get into vulnerable people, because vulnerable person. We've used that term once already. The Criminal Records Act defines a vulnerable person as one who, because of their age, under 18 or over 65, a disability, or other circumstances, whether temporary or permanent, is in a position of dependency on others and is otherwise at a greater risk of being harmed than the general population by a person in a position of trust or authority towards them. That's a mouthful. I get it. But we do encourage everyone to really take into consideration the second part of this definition and consider vulnerability on a case-by-case basis when necessary. So this definition, it's really useful in a lot of general ways, but there's obviously special circumstances in which a person might still be considered vulnerable. So this is where that other circumstances part of the definition comes into play. Like, think about your clients, your employees, or even just your friends and family, and think about what circumstances might make them vulnerable. Like, for example, is a new Canadian that still has to deal with language barriers considered vulnerable? Or would people in the LGBTQ plus area be considered vulnerable as well? Those are, things to consider. And there's not a clear-cut answer within the Criminal Records Act on those things, which is kind of where that other circumstances part comes into play. Okay, so position of trust and authority. We've used this term too. So the definition of a position of trust and authority is subjective to opinion, but there are some common factors that can be used to determine if someone is in a position of trust and authority. The first is decision-making power. So this might be somebody like a teacher who has the ability to sway a person's decision-making one way or another. The second factor is whether or not a person has unsupervised access to a vulnerable person. So a good example of this might be like a coach we were saying earlier, who could potentially have a lot of alone time, one-on-one time with a person while training. And then the third would be somebody who has an inherent closeness in their relationship with a vulnerable person. So think about this like maybe like a big brother or big sister mentor. Like you're interacting with a vulnerable person in a relationship that just kind of automatically creates a certain level of closeness that other positions might not. We also consider a position of trust and authority as one where someone conducts personal tasks for a person. So maybe like Meals on Wheels drivers. That's a good example. And then lastly, we also consider someone in a position of trust and authority when they take full responsibility for the well-being of another. So think about like live-in caregivers, respite nurses, that type of person. Okay, so understanding these terms, duty of care, standard of care, vulnerable person, and a position of trust and authority, we can get into discussing screening in general, but also into the world of PICs. Okay, so before you even consider going and getting a PIC, it's really important to think about a few things that might create roadblocks along the way. As I noted before, there are many different terms that are used across the country to describe a police information check. So before even getting started, it might be helpful to reach out to your local police service and ask what they call their police information checks, and also what their process is for performing checks. Now, we're dealing with Edmonton, obviously, and EPS is always open to help you navigate their online and in-person systems, including today. So if you have any kind of specific questions about, maybe the new online system, keep those questions noted and we'll chat about them. But if you're working with other municipalities, and a lot of organizations that might be like headquartered in Edmonton might still have volunteers working across the province, like it might be a provincial organization. So make sure that you're working with the police or the RCMP in the regions that those volunteers are to know what the processes for PICs are in those areas. So, Edmonton has a police information check unit that you can reach out to about this stuff, meaning that if you walk into any old police station in Edmonton, you might get some confused looks if you just start asking for a PIC. But some smaller municipalities don't have that division, so keep that in mind. Next thing to consider is if you actually have any plans for how to deal with the information contained in a police information check. If you are asking volunteers to obtain a PIC of any kind, but you have no idea how to actually use the information you receive from these checks, then it really just creates an extra step for them. Before asking for a PIC, talk to your organization or your board, or even just your volunteers about the risks that are related to the position that you're getting a check done for. And, think about like what criminal history that could appear in a check would be off limits for that type of position. And how will your organization handle communicating with a volunteer if those checks reveal red flags? That's another thing that people don't always think about. And, what doesn't come up in a police information check that you would still need to know about after the check? Like if you have a certain position that requires a certain type of behavior that isn't outlined in any, criminal proceeding, but you still need it, then a PIC isn't really going to serve you that well. Okay, so the next one is, what's your process when you're actually interacting with the police? So, are you sending your volunteer to go obtain their checks, or are you actually getting the check done on their behalf and having the information released to your organization? If you'd like to do it on their behalf, you'd need to actually they would need to actually give you permission to obtain those checks on their behalf. And there may also be a different process for obtaining third-party checks versus an individual requesting a personal check, depending on the municipality. So again, if you need more information, you can reach out to EPS directly. You can reach out to the municipalities that you're dealing with directly if you're a provincial organization. And the last thing, consider the processes that your police service actually employs to do their checks. So how much does it cost? How long does it take? Is it online or in person? And how does that all affect your work? Okay. When you go to actually get a police information check, there's numerous different sources for the information you might receive. And in this presentation, we're not going to cover all of the specific things that could be disclosed in a PIC. I think, and Hillary, if I'm overpromising anything, just let me know later. I think that Hillary might be able to help you out more with that than I can. Yeah, if you have questions about that, just kind of keep them noted. But we are going to go over some of the basic places that you're going to get information from in a PIC. So when you're getting them, there's kind of a few different databases, including the Canadian Police Information Center, which is a national database. Then there's the Police Information Portal, which is a tool that provides indexes of local police records across Canada. Provincially, police can also access the Justice Online Information Network, which is actually the Alberta Courts database, or, yeah. And then lastly, local police record databases are also used when obtaining police information checks. Now, beyond regular police information checks, you can also request vulnerable sector checks of a police service. So we call those VSCs. A VSC is done in addition to a PIC, and it is not a separate document or process. So VSCs, they're only meant to be performed when an individual will be in a position of trust and authority with vulnerable people. So the main difference in a vulnerable sector check is that it will access the above databases and then provide the information that a PIC normally would, but it's also going to confirm if the applicant has not received a record suspension for sexual offenses. So, yeah. Oh, and right, so additionally, it's also really important to remember that for VSCs, the checks can only be completed by a police service in which the applicant resides, unless the police service in which the applicant resides is actually authorized to do so. So this means, for VSCs, it's recommended that if an applicant has resided somewhere else within the past 5 years, they also receive checks from that other jurisdiction that they've resided in. Now, this comes to the big question: when do you actually need to get these things done? So it would be great if there was a clear-cut way to determine if your volunteers need a PIC or a VSC, but it really does depend on the circumstances of your organization. And this is why we remind people on a regular basis we don't provide legal advice, and we aren't liable for your organization's specific usage of PICs and VSCs, because it is quite specific to an organization. There are no policies that mandate the use of PICs for your volunteers across the board, or at least, external policies outside of your organization. And even when we consider duty of care, police information checks can be one part of a multifaceted approach to fulfilling duty of care. There are sometimes requirements from insurance agencies or from parent organizations to perform PICs outside of the normal scope of when one might receive a PIC, but organizations should be aware that their screening processes should request PICs and VSCs when needed, and not just as a blanket procedure for every volunteer. Yeah, so there are some good rules of thumb, though, to follow when we're identifying when a police information check is needed, so we'll go over those. Okay, so according to the screening handbook from Volunteer Canada and Public Safety Canada, one of the main reasons that a volunteer would get a PIC is if they're in contact with vulnerable people, but they're not in a position of trust and authority. So to give an example, you might ask somebody taking tickets at a fundraiser for senior citizens to get a police information check because they will likely be in contact with vulnerable people, but they aren't really in a position of trust and authority over them. You'd also consider getting a PIC if the volunteer is handling money or financial information or just sensitive information in general. So, for example, if you have a volunteer that handles cash registers or a float for your organization, that might be considered a reasonable time to get a PIC. And then lastly, if the volunteer has access to vehicles or just generally expensive equipment as part of their duties, that might also be a good reason to get a PIC. But again, it really does depend on the organization. Okay, so vulnerable sector checks. The reasonable uses for vulnerable sector checks are a bit more strict. So PICs are asked for in many different circumstances, but VSCs are only really supposed to be asked for when specific criteria are met as per the Criminal Records Act and the Alberta Police Information Check Disclosure Guidelines. And if your positions don't fall within those parameters, then you won't be getting a vulnerable sector check. You're not able to. So a VSC is required when an individual will be in a position of trust or authority over vulnerable persons. And as we described earlier, a position of trust and authority is not merely somebody who just comes in contact with a vulnerable person. A position of trust and authority has to be significant and a result of the person's position. So essentially, a person's position of trust and authority can't just be incidental. Like if you have somebody, like, this is actually a thing that's coming up a lot because there was an announcement around the Charitable Fundraising Act around making sure that board members get police information checks. And a lot of people are just assuming they need a vulnerable sector check for their board because they're working with, vulnerable people incidentally. Like, their board members also do a few things around the organization that are a little bit more hands-on. And we try to tell people that the actual position that the board member is in, the volunteer position, is a board member, and being a board member doesn't require that they interact with those people. Those people are just doing that as other voluntary activities for the organization. They might be in an entirely different volunteer position. It's not required by being a board member. So if somebody's helping, another example is like if somebody's, helping to volunteer at a festival and they unexpectedly find themselves alone with a vulnerable person, this doesn't mean that they should have a vulnerable sector check. These checks are meant to be done for volunteers that actually have trust and authority built into the structure of their volunteer positions. So a great example, is a coach. For a kids sports team, coaches generally take full responsibility for the vulnerable people during practice, and they regularly work one-on-one with vulnerable people, and that is actually a part of their volunteer position. The level of supervision isn't necessarily something outlined in the Criminal Records Act as much, but it's a good metric for determining somebody's level of trust and authority. So if somebody is in a position of trust and authority and is given alone time with a vulnerable person, that is usually a reason to seek a vulnerable sector check, because they do have a duty of care for the well-being of that person if no one else can. Okay. So it's really important for you to find a balance in the screening process. PICs are just one part of the screening process, and Alberta Police will, never make the call as to whether or not your organization should engage a specific volunteer. This is meant to be done on an organization by organization basis based on your screening processes. So PICs can be really useful, but it's important to know the drawbacks and the benefits of these checks if you want to develop a robust screening policy. Okay, so the first limitation is cost. This can be a burden for organizations and for volunteers. The cost to conduct a police information check is not standard across the province, and a police information check can range, all over the map from like $15 to, I think at one point this presentation noted $60. I don't know if that's still true. I think it depends on the check. But the cost is typically higher for those of you working with volunteers in urban communities. So like Edmonton, this is, big part of it. These costs can be a bit of a limitation for your organization if you're actually absorbing the cost. And if you're passing that cost off onto the volunteer, that's also a really big barrier for volunteer engagement, because often volunteers will just, drop off the map if you ask them to pay anything to do volunteering. So the way that you structure your volunteer positions and the level of risk involved in a volunteer's work, it can actually impact those costs. The next limitation here is time. So the length of time that it takes to obtain a PIC can be an issue for an organization or a volunteer. You should be aware of the timeline that actually comes with performing a PIC and ask yourself questions when deciding to request a PIC. So are you putting volunteers in their roles before you have the information from police services, or are you waiting? Will the higher risk duties of the position start immediately after the volunteer begins their work? Or, how does this waiting time affect your volunteer engagement and your turnover rate if you actually do want them to just wait until the PIC is done? So, say you have like a position with the Red Cross or something like that. Can that person start training before they get their PIC? Can they do like basic administrative volunteer work before they get their PIC? That's a question that you might be asking yourself. The next one is privacy and protection. So privacy is of chief importance when you're dealing with PICs of any kind. So think about the processes and the procedures you actually have in place when you're handling sensitive information. How do you store the information you receive? How do you interpret this information? What convictions are a no-go to volunteer with your organization? How long do you keep the information you collect? How is information disposed of? These are all questions you should ask yourself, and you should read the appropriate privacy legislation for your organization. So that might be PIPA, the Freedom of Information and Protection Act, so FOIP, and then there's also PIPEDA, which is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. Next, for limitations is participation, and this kind of comes up in both sides, in the limitations and the pro. So another drawback to PICS is how it impacts participation in an organization. So I can illustrate this with an example. So a person wishes to volunteer with your organization, and they have a record that lists a conviction for a DUI around when they turned 18. It's been several years since then, and they have no other infractions on their file. In a situation like this, does your organization have processes in place to judge if they can or cannot volunteer with you? You'd be surprised by how many organizations would just not work with this type of volunteer and have no policies to support receiving or handling the information, any information they may not expect like that. So this person, they may not be able to volunteer even in a very low-risk role that doesn't interact with vulnerable populations at all, entirely because of one mistake from a long time ago. So if there are no policies in place to deal with these situations and volunteers, then people who are eager to volunteer for you might not be able to in positions that are actually suitable for them just because of the police information check. But again, it really does depend on the organization. So this is becoming, even more important when you're engaging court-approved volunteers or people who are rehabilitating. We're talking a lot more about working with people with lived experience in nonprofit right now. So how do you deal with a person who may have a fairly extensive police record but still wants to volunteer? Another limitation is trust. Another drawback to PICS is that it impacts the perceived level of trust you have in a volunteer. So volunteers, they can sometimes feel like they're being asked for a police information check because the organization doesn't trust them. And based on research done by Volunteer Alberta, organizations in Alberta have expressed a 3-to-1 drop-off rate when PICS or VSCs are requested. And this might be multiple reasons. It might be cost, it might be trust, it might be a very, a host of different reasons. But for every 3 volunteers asked to complete a PIC or VSC, 1 gives up. That's the data that we had. So this doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask for a PIC, though. It does mean that your organization should be prepared to communicate why PICs are being asked for and how they feed into the rest of your organization's screening practices, so people don't feel like they're being picked on by your own processes. Okay, so the benefits. We're on the benefits side here. So benefits is obviously protection. You're ensuring your clients are safe from potential harm. Your organization is taking steps to provide duty of care. This is the main reason why people ask for PICs, and it's because they want to make sure that they catch any past behavior that might signal future risks to their community members, and that's perfectly valid and reasonable. Next is risk and liability. So often organizations are expected to perform police information checks as part of risk mitigation or liability insurance. And, if you're fulfilling a requirement from your insurance company or your board or your parent organization, then that could be actually a benefit too. So, your board might be having active discussions around policy and risk, and PICs could be mandated by the organization's bylaws or policies. Those types of things are important. Then your insurance provider, they also take a look at your volunteer screening processes quite often, and they'll determine what types of things are necessary to ensure that you maintain coverage. So making sure that you're actually kind of keeping up to date with all of these different requirements to, stay within line your kind of risk and liability processes, that can actually be really beneficial. It can ensure that you're kind of doing your due diligence when it comes to risk management. The next is care and safety. Another benefit to a PIC is that it has to do with the public perception of care and safety, so a little bit different from protection. When performing a PIC, your organization is also telling the world that you are being diligent in putting the needs of your clients and those you serve first. So it does signal that is kind of what's happening. And then we also have participation on the benefits side. So this one appears in both columns because sometimes PICs can actually help people feel like they have a little bit more more of a professional involvement with the organization that they're dealing with. So if it's a professional requirement, if your organization is engaging high-risk populations and they need a skilled volunteer who has a specific background, a skilled volunteer, they might not feel comfortable volunteering with an organization that doesn't adhere to industry standards that include police information checks. So that's another thing to think about. And then the trust side as well, kind of similar to the participation bit, your organization is perceived as being more trustworthy when you conduct a police information check by external stakeholders, but also by volunteers. So people want to be assured that an organization has good intentions and is sufficiently screening their volunteers. So for example, when volunteering for relief positions like the Red Cross, I mentioned them earlier, I'll kind of bring them up again, they're required to go training for 6 months before they're able to volunteer. And the people who commit to this type of volunteer opportunity are different than the people who are just looking for a fun weekend activity with friends and family. So their trust in an organization may actually be developed through the screening process and picked specifically and not hampered by it. Okay, so I'm going to actually do a little bit of a worksheet with you because we'd like to make sure that with these resources that we provide that we give you something that you can actually work with, something that you can take away. And this isn't attached to the presentation, that's my bad, but I'll make sure that it actually gets emailed out afterwards so you can actually have this template. But to illustrate some of the concepts above, I thought that we'd kind of go through one of the resources we have, which is the development of a volunteer position and linking it directly to the considerations that you might make when you're kind of considering a police information check. So you can read through this really quickly. It's kind of small, but we got a hospice client support volunteer. Their duties and activities, they enhance client quality of life through emotional and social care and practical non-medical assistance. They support clients without giving advice, judging, or trying to fix. They provide one-to-one end-of-life support. They co-facilitate a group session on bereavement support. And then we've also got the client, people served. So seniors, they're living with life-limiting illness in this organization, as well as their families. The location is a seniors facility. This was obviously done before COVID, so bear with me that this might not be the reality for everybody right now, but still kind of works as an example. Supervision and training, there's ongoing support, but there's no direct supervision for one-to-one co-facilitator, or for one-to-one sessions and co-facilitator for a group session is there. Other details, they might be comfortable talking about death or dying or bereavement, like the volunteer should be comfortable talking about death, dying, or bereavement. That's a thing that should be required for that type of position. And just 1 second here. Come on. Sorry. My presentation doesn't seem to want to move. Sorry, everyone. Bear with me. I've definitely used a PowerPoint before. There we go. So this was the position we were just talking about, a little bit closer up so you can kind of see what we were talking about. Okay, so what are some of the considerations that we might have for this type of position? So what are the required skills and abilities or the qualities that are needed for this role? So they might need a degree in social work. I mean, that might be a thing that they need. It really depends on the organization. You'll have to forgive me. I don't actually work for one of those types of organizations, so this might be totally off base, but this is some assumption. But obviously, in a position like this, they would need patience and they'd probably need first aid training. Now, what are the risks? Complications involved with clients at end of life. That could be many different things, but the organization is also liable if duty of care is not upheld. So if you're not appropriately caring for this person, the organization and also the volunteer could be liable, but depends on the situation. What are the risks? There's a high degree of trust and authority with clients and clients' family members in that situation. are there policies in place to address these risks? So does your organization actually have anything that talks about these risks and how you should be dealing with them? So we're going to say yes, just for the example, we're going to say yes, there are policies in place. List any potential questions you might ask to determine the above. So what kinds of certification might this volunteer need? We were talking about a degree earlier. Who are they accountable to aside from the client? So we were talking about clients' family members, but they're also accountable to the organization. If they have a direct supervisor, they might be accountable to them. If they're kind of co-facilitating groups, they're accountable to the group and also to the co-facilitator. What's the appropriate standard of care in elder care? That's another thing you should really be thinking about. I do not actually know what the appropriate standard of care is for elder care, but I am sure that there is one. And then use this section as a tool to help make a determination. So is the client under 18 years old? No, the client is over 65 though. Clients that are near end of life often have disabilities, temporary or permanent. Volunteer has unsupervised access to a client. We've established that in the position. The volunteer is in a position of trust and authority with the vulnerable person. So they do actually have a certain inherent closeness in the relationship, as we were talking about, and the client is dependent upon the volunteer in this situation. So, is a police information check necessary? And is a vulnerable sector check necessary? So we're going to say yes to both of those, because a PIC, it might reveal criminal convictions related to their social work, if they were a social worker. And is a vulnerable sector check necessary? Well, a VSC might reveal the existence of sexual offenses related to elders, and the volunteer will be regularly unsupervised in a position of trust and authority. I guess that's the end. That's the end of the content portion, I should say. So we're going to move right over into questions here. So I can answer any questions that you might have about volunteer screening, but we also have Hillary here, who can answer any questions that you might have of EPS about the PIC process. And I know that there's kind of a new online process, so if anybody has questions around that, that would be probably a good place to start. Again, you can use the questions pane to type in questions, or you can use the hands up button to just let me know you want to talk. Hillary, did you have any thoughts as we were going through? Anything that you maybe wanted to say?
No, just that, yeah, we are on board with what you're saying about like everything. So yeah, PIC shouldn't be the only thing that you're using for screening. For all the reasons that Graham just said. That's kind of what we like to say as well, because it is just a view of past behavior. It's just a screenshot of the applicant's life up until that moment that we ran it. So yeah, and with the VS2, I know that some people think that we're just giving them a hard time, but we're not trying to.
For sure. Actually, I do have somebody's hand up, Markian. So I'm going to unmute you here, Markian.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
Perfect, thanks for this. Listen, so you raised a couple things really when you were talking about the volunteers' residents out from another jurisdictions, and you also talked about, kind of a 5-year timeline. The PIC seems to pick up everything from it is Canada in scope. So, I mean, basically the question is, what is another jurisdictions and why the 5 years? If there is what they did 5 years, like 10 years ago, not important, I guess maybe just clarify that.
Yeah, so I guess I can jump in there.
Sure.
So when we're doing the police information check, a lot of I shouldn't say this, some organizations don't do what we call a local indice, or they don't publish, or which is just upload their police files, or use what we call PIP, so the police information portal. So let's just make up places. So let's say St. Albert doesn't, they do, but let's say that St. Albert doesn't publish their local files to PIP, so this police information portal. If we were to run an applicant in Edmonton, because now they just moved to Edmonton and we run their application, should they have a pattern of behavior that's recent and maybe could be relevant to the position they're applying for, we might not have access to that. So if they were never charged, it's more for the non-convictions, is what that 5-year history comes. Because you're right, when we do run it, you're running the Canadian, like the national database of criminal convictions, as well as the Alberta court system. If they lived outside of Alberta, that might be somewhere you might want to look and potentially have it done in the province that they used to live in, just for if they have any upcoming court or anything like that that we don't have access to.
I guess my concern, okay, thanks. Now, what about out of country? So, I mean, we have a lot of new immigrants to Canada.
Yeah, so those you shouldn't worry too much about because they go through their own like checks and stuff at the border. So yeah, if there's anything there, like we won't even be able to disclose anything that's from, let's say, the United States of America. If they have a record there, we don't have that information.
Right.
Yeah,
But
so
you're saying the normal screening process to migrate to a country, to Canada, checks those things.
yeah, they'll do a very extensive check.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Cool. Thank you, Marky. I'm just gonna mute you again here because there's another person who has their hand up. So we've got Drew with their hand up here. Hey, Drew. I'm just gonna unmute you here. Oh, I see. Sorry, I'm just trying to unmute you, but I'm not quite getting it. Oh, there we go.
All right, I'm going to unmute myself.
Yep, there we go.
Perfect. Thanks, Graham.
No
My
problem.
question is for Hillary. Hillary, our organization hasn't been doing any police checks at the moment because we don't have any current active volunteers or very many. We're soon going to be embarking on getting a whole bunch of our volunteers to do their police information and vulnerable sector checks. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or feedback from folks who have used the new online tool. Is there any common mistakes that volunteers are making or that organizations are making, or anything we can do to help make the process really smooth for our organization, the volunteers, your office? Any sort of advice you have on that?
Yeah, so one is that if there's two options, I guess, for you. One is that if you are going to have your applicants pay for themselves, they can just apply online. If you want to do like a third party, like Graham was saying, if you want, we call it a batch submission at the Edmonton Police Service. So if you wanted to do that, that's basically you requesting the results of the applicants themselves through your organization. Then we can set you up so that you're using an online system where you just enter in like their name and email address. The request gets sent to them via email, and they complete it online, and the results then come back to you guys. That seems to be the best option. We've had a lot of good feedback from it. Currently, the only thing that there's been a hiccup with it is we're not seeing the certificates actually being available online, and Triton is currently working on that. But if you are set up, you can just send me like a list and I can send you the certificates. But yeah, otherwise there haven't really been too many that have come to myself anyways. I guess the biggest thing is just making sure that the applicants themselves are uploading a third-party consent that I will send you as well when you get set up.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, we previously used the paper batch submission process, so I'm really interested to try out the new online one.
Yeah, and I have like a how-to guide, so if you just touch base with me, if you haven't yet, I'll send that out to you, and then if you have any questions or anything, you could obviously let me know.
Yeah, and also in the follow-up email, I'll make sure that I CC Hillary just so you kind of have her email if you need help. That's okay, right, Hillary? Just want to make
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and then that way, if you have any questions following up, that would be the best place to reach out to. Yeah, and actually, I think that one thing that VA is actually planning on doing as well is we're currently trying to collect up just the different processes or what we can get information on for the different municipalities throughout the whole province. And Hillary sent that to us as well, like the document that she's referring to. So we're hoping to kind of create a little bit of an index of these different processes that we can provide to people who have VSPNs as well, just so they know going into different municipalities what to expect, just in terms of the bare bones, like what it will actually look like to get a police information check done. So yeah. Okay. So does anybody else have any questions here? I also want to make sure that everyone knows that if you kind of have questions going forward, or if you want to review anything that we talked about today, I'm going to be sending out a recording of this, so you can always follow up with either me or Hillary afterwards, and that's totally fine. And the volunteer screening program presentations are also supposed to be, fairly available. So if you have other people that you think this might be useful for, feel free to share the recording with them as well. Yeah, within your organization, I should say. Okay. I'm not seeing any of their hands up here or any questions in the question box. Yeah. I think that's about... Oh, I see one here. Okay, Adrian. I'm trying to unmute you here, but sometimes the mute button seems to be a little bit difficult. Sorry, this is... yeah, I'm not quite sure why I'm not able to unmute here. Just a second. Sorry.
When I did it, I just had to click on the unmute button myself.
Oh, I see. Okay, thanks, Drew. Okay. Oh, there we go. Hey, Adrian.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks very much for this time and opportunity. I'm not really looking for advice. I'm just wondering if there's any experience that could be shared. So our organization works very closely with schools, and your distinction between the PIC and the VSD was really helpful, because we kind of struggle with knowing whether or not our role is necessarily in a position of trust or of authority, but typically teachers and other education staff are present when we are working with vulnerable persons. So I guess what I'm asking is, I think we lean more towards a PIC than we would a VSC because of the nature of engagement with schools. And I'm just wondering if there's any practices that you have come across with experience that might just help add more context to help us make that distinction.
Did you want to field that one, Hillary? Or
Yeah. Do you mind if I know what your position is, or like what you're doing in the schools?
Yeah, so I work for an organization. We're called Everactive Schools, and typically what we do is we will partner with schools to go in and provide programming around health and wellness initiatives. So sometimes we might be providing instruction directly to students. We might be hosting events on the school grounds where we are interacting with the students. And sometimes we might be hosting events where teachers are bringing their students to our event to participate in a half day or a full day of activities.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, if we were to ask you that, if someone was applying, like let's say you were applying, I would have no issue giving you the VS, because you're in the schools, you're interacting, you've been like introduced by the teachers, the kids will think that you're a safe space. So although you might not be like directly responsible for their well-being, you will definitely have like their trust. So we would feel comfortable giving you the VS.
That's helpful. Thank you, Hillary.
Yeah, no worries.
I think internally when we go over VSPN applications at VA as well, like for vulnerable sector check fee waivers, like that's like that type of distinction comes up a lot for us too, and hopefully we're on the same page as EPS when we are making those determinations. But yeah, like I think we've had kind of positions like that come across our desk as well, and I think that often we say, like, if the person is actually like deferring to the teacher,
Mhm.
we wonder if that's like a position of trust and authority, like if the person is kind of like like an assistant or something like that. Is that ever a thing that kind of comes up in your mind, Hillary, like if they're kind of deferring to another position of trust and authority?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my words together. We definitely do. So when we look at it, it is definitely the relationship with the vulnerable person. And a lot of people think that it just has to do with the authority, like they have, like, but it's a lot to do with the trust. So, like, even let's say, like a correctional officer, so they're in a suit or like a uniform. They look like an officer. So if a kid should see them, they would like have that trust with them already. They would think they're someone I can go to for help. So that's a big thing to think of too. So like when people are going in to present to kids or like host functions like this and stuff, although you might not have all that time in the world to build a relationship one-on-one with those children, they will still think of you as like they have the trust in you because you've come in, the teachers have introduced you, so you have that trust with them.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. Actually, that brings up a question that I had. And I'm not seeing any other hands up here, unless Adrian, you had another question. Because I see your hand.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to lower it. No, we're good.
Oh, it's all good. It's all good. I did have one question that actually kind of comes up a lot, just on our end, with people who are required by like a parent organization's policies or an insurance company to get vulnerable sector checks, even though a position might not need it. What do you usually end up saying to them?
We definitely refer back to the Criminal Records Act. So yes, maybe someone has put in this policy that requires an employee or a volunteer to have the vulnerable sector search. We legally can't run it under the Criminal Records Act. So that's just what we go back to, and we just we ask them their position, what they're doing, and yeah, if we can't make justification, then we have to just tell them, unfortunately, I understand, but that we can't run it for the purpose of it's the RCMP's database, so we have to follow their guidelines that they have put up, as well as the Criminal Records Act.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Can
I know we thought of, yeah.
Yeah, we get that question a lot from people. It's just like I think often insurers aren't aware of that detail. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any other hands up. I'm not seeing any questions in the question box, and it's 1:01 now. So I'm gonna do one last call out. 5 seconds. If anybody has a question, now's the time. Okay, I think we're good. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming, Hillary. I really, really appreciate that. That was really informative, and I will make sure that we get all this information out to everybody. It might be a day or so before I send it, because there's all the uploading time and everything that goes into getting the recording in our database, and then I'll make sure that I send it out with all the handouts that are necessary. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day.